I will at this point introduce you to Dr. Saeed Haider, who is head of academic subjects for the International Foundation here at Royal College in UK. He's currently working on a monograph on Muslim modernities on the Hindi screen and has published most recently an essay on the media coverage of the shootings in Orlando in the journal entitled Men and Masculinities. Dr. Said is also a contributor in Kristen Peterson's forthcoming edited volume, that is Muslims in the Movies, a Global Anthology. He's a member of the Challenging Precarity, a Global Network, uh, which is exactly where I met him during one of their conferences in Rome early this year in January. His research interests lie in cultural industries as well as the ways in which cultural products act as vehicles for the transmission of ideas. And I think his pre-reading list, as well as the video clips that he shared some time back, you'll be able to tell already, are about Sufi aesthetics and the making of Islam in Bollywood. Hence the title of his talk today, Sufism in Indian Cinema. With this, I request Dr. Said Haider to please begin his talk. And I think we will have 45 minutes of listening to you, and we'll go into some kind of an interactive format. Over to Dr.
Thank you.
Said.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rumika. It's an honor for me to be invited to speak today, and the wonders of technology, to be doing it so far away from you all, but to be able to see you on the screens is brilliant. And thank you also to Shivangi for helping set this up and get this going. So it's a real honor. Rumika and I met at a conference at the Precarity Network, Global Network conference recently, and it was a delight to interact with Rumika and talk to her. So I was delighted when Rumika invited me to deliver this little talk, really. It seems particularly appropriate today, as in India, it is Eid today, I believe. It has been so yesterday for us, and in Pakistan, and also in America.
Eid
So
Mubarak,
it seems
all
particularly.
of us. I'm sorry.
Thank you,
I'm
yes.
done with that. My bad. Eid Mubarak.
No, absolutely. Extending my warmest wishes to you all as well. So it seems particularly appropriate that we are here talking about the representation and presentation of Islam in Indian cinema, which is an area of research, my area of research in particular. Just to give you a little bit of a frame before I launch into the paper itself. In my studies of Indian cinema in particular, I'm very much interested in working in the sort of tradition of Charles Taylor and the idea of the social imaginary, Anderson's notion of nations as imagined communities. And therefore, for me, there's a great deal of significance in cultural products as ways of reading social imaginations, how a society, a country may be thinking, what's going through, what's happening at a given time within a nation's imagination. And I'm very much following in the tradition of my own supervisor, Rachel Dwyer, whom I'm sure some of you know. And so, her recent, I think, publication, maybe a few years now, particularly looking at India through Hindi films and Indian cinema in particular. So I'm very much following in that vein of that tradition. One of the things I've noticed, for instance, is that films in particular that deal with Muslims through a political lens struggle often. There's many questions of belonging, identity, issues to do with really Muslim sort of citizenship, if you will, of India as a modern state, the legacy of partition, etc., that sort of constantly hound the imagination. And yet, alongside that political kind of turmoil, the difficulties of political dramas or thrillers dealing with Muslim characters and Islam, there is this really wonderful parallel truth, which is that Indian cinema has, from its very inception, embraced a sort of Muslim aesthetics, what Marshall Hodgson may term sort of an Islamicate, so an Indian Islamicate. Indian cinema particularly seems enthralled by a history of Islam that has been rich in the Indian soil. So one of the things I'm fascinated by is how does these two parallel elements or truths, how do you reconcile those? What's going on in the Indian imagination? What is the place of Islam and Muslims in the Indian imaginary? So the talk effectively is titled Sufism and the Aestheticization of Muslims and Islam in Bollywood. So if the political lens talks about the difficulties, there is an alternative lens through which to commune or relate to or coexist with difference, and that lens for me is very much the aesthetic. So with that sort of very rough frame, let me get started on Sufism and the aestheticization of Muslims and Islam in Bollywood. It is noteworthy that over its 100-year history, Indian cinema has never produced a feature film based on Sufism or any of the major Sufi saints. The Ministry of Information did commission a documentary on Sufism in 1994 titled The Lamp in the Niche, with an aim to present Sufism as a broadly tolerant movement, Islamic in its origin, but more akin to the devotional bhakti currents of Hinduism than anything else. And this is an idea that Carl Ernst has written about, and from whom I borrow this reference to the documentary. Ernst's assessment of the documentary reveals how Sufism is deployed as an embodiment of South Asian Islamic culture. In this talk, I want to explore how Sufism serves as a floating signifier that is represented through a set of aesthetic techniques rather than understood as a purely Islamic mode of practice. This is demonstrated in two films that I will be concentrating on mainly: M.F. Hussein's Meenakshi, A Tale of Three Cities, released in 2004, and Milan Luthrier's Dirty Picture, released in 2011. Although competing definitions of Sufism are available, an absolute definition, as Naseem Pak Shiraz acknowledges, is difficult to arrive at. Even though she settles for Sufism in the end to refer to, quote, a mystical dimension of Islam. The problem that follows such a definition, however, is the need to pin down what is meant by mysticism, which she does by drawing on the work of Schimmel, Chittock, and Smith, very sort of respected names in the world of Sufism and academic sort of study of Sufism. Schimmel, for instance, defines mysticism as love of the absolute, for the power that separates true mysticism from mere asceticism is love. Divine love makes the seeker capable of bearing, even enjoying, all the pains and afflictions that God showers upon him in order to test him and purify his soul. While the lexicon employed to describe Sufism differs from that used to describe more scripturalist forms of Islam, the aspirations expressed often cross over the binary that places Sufism in opposition to a host of other Islams. Martin van Grunsman, in a 2009 edition, argues this most persuasively, and though he does not use the word mysticism, he questions views that see mysticism as something that can be detached from Islam more broadly conceived and placed under the rubric of Sufism. The opposition that Sufism is brought in to designate is something Grunsman questions in his assessment of the work of Clifford Geertz and Ernest Gellner, for instance. Borrowing the terms doctor and saint from the latter, Grunsman writes, "The doctor and the saint do not necessarily represent competing styles of Islam, but have been part of a single complex for most of the time. High and low Islam, if those concepts have any value, cannot simply be identified with urban versus rural and Salafi versus Sufi. Opposition to popular saint cults and the loud festivals at shrines has not only come from anti-Sufi scholars, but has also been part of an ongoing debate within Sufism." What does this mean? Is there no such thing as Sufism? Is Sufism merely Islam and Islam merely Sufism? So what Grunsman is doing is he's questioning the splitting of the mystical from Islam, the doctrinal, and he's arguing that that split is an inappropriate split to some extent, that really one ought to see it as a continuum. But I wonder what does this mean? Is there no such thing as Sufism? Is Sufism merely Islam and Islam merely Sufism? I think the word necessarily in Bruisman's quote is helpful for my argument regarding the way a softer Islam is imagined in Hindi cinema, and how this is used for the expression of a distinct Muslim modernity. Certain strands of Sufism can be positioned in opposition to a more doctrinal, ulama-centric Islam, both Sunni and Shia. The doctor and saint distinction does not necessarily represent competing styles of Islam, but they can come to do so. And this is how Hindi cinema has largely presented Indian Sufi Islam, meaning mostly through the saint sort of element rather than the doctrinal or doctor element that Gelner and others sort of designate for high and low Islam, perhaps. In Hindi cinema, Sufism, therefore, is a floating signifier, a shifting, malleable collection of motifs, symbols, and metaphors that together help give form to a particular imagination of Islam and Muslim. Hindi films that employ Sufi motifs and metaphors utilize particular aesthetic textures that are associated with an Islamic culture historically rooted in India. Articulated like this, it may not make much sense to ask too definitively what a Sufi film looks like, given that a film deemed Sufi may simply scope to the interplay of these motifs and metaphors. So, interpreted in this way, a certain reading of Hindi films reveals the extent to which a Sufi face of Islam permeates Hindi cinema without the overt problems inherent in other forms of Muslim representation, and most notably so in the political representation of Muslims. The aesthetic emerges as an alternative modality through which an Indian imaginary engages with Islam and Muslims, because it is in the aesthetics of Hindi films that Sufism finds its fullest expression. Sufism, writes Adonis, is distinctive in that, in its search for the absolute, it resorts to poetry when it wishes to express its most profound feelings. Naseem Shiraz acknowledges much the same when she suggests that the, quote, open-endedness of poetic language, in contrast to the argumentative language of science and logic, give it an elasticity that allows it to refer to multiple signifiers. Mystical experience compels the mystic to share his unique perspective with others, even though it is too ineffable or subtle to be precisely conveyed. End quote. Poetry, and the aesthetic more generally for my purposes, is deployed as a more fitting vehicle to communicate nuances that are otherwise difficult to conceptualize. Those readers, warns Adonis, who enter this world of Sufism reliant on the ostensible external meanings of phrases will find it difficult. To put it another way, he says, it is virtually impossible to enter the Sufi world by way of explanation, for allusion rather than explanation is the main portal. Such an interplay of meaning and ambiguity, allusion and evasion can be seen in M.F. Hussein's Meenakshi, A Tale of Three Cities. Meenakshi has a disjointed narrative style which underpins the film's arcane quality. Dealing with a Muslim novelist who is struggling to write a novel, the crux of the film centers around Nawab's meeting with the character of Meenakshi, played by Dabu, an encounter that begins the film's surreal foray into a world of imagination and storytelling, where the boundary between the real and the imagined blurs. Nawab is instantly drawn to Meenakshi, whom he imagines in different roles, from a perfume seller in Hyderabad to an orphan girl named Maria in Prague. Meenakshi, meanwhile, flits in and out of the narratives Nawab imagines for her, always sardonic and critical of his contrived tales. This flitting in and out, existing both in the diegetic world of the film and speaking from beyond it, makes Meenakshi displays Meenakshi's quintessential trait of liminality so central to the film, both in terms of theme and style. In a 2003 interview, Hussain spoke of how he enjoyed playing with words, saying, "It's another kind of discipline altogether." Meenakshi, the film, is all about playing, mixing, and blurring. Santosh Sivan's cinematography, for which he won a Screen Award, is profuse with vivid colors and lighting that blend with Ashley Rebello's and Raisa Hussain's costume design. Sivan spoke of working with Hussain in an interview for The Hindu published in 2004. "It was exciting to work for the first time with a painter," he recounts. "I realized from day one that his sensibility was something different. Hussain has a deep understanding of color and tone, volume and dimension. His visuals bore the imprint of a painter's feel for colors, arising from constant experimentation and years of exploring their possibilities." End quote. Blurring boundaries, mixing mediums, and meaning is a key motif in Meenakshi, a style that contributes to the film's avant-garde aspirations and the creation of a cinematic, postmodern/mystical idiom. Meenakshi sets up this paradigm of Sufism and postmodernism through a non-linear narrative structure, an overt use of Sufi imagery, and an ambiguity of character that complements postmodern and Sufi tropes. Patrick Hogan suggests that Hussain recruits the practices of postmodernism to Sufi ends through a deliberate blurring of temporality. The frame story of Nawab weaves in and out of the subsequent stories of Meenakshi and Kameshwar, set in Jaisalmer, and Kameshwar and Maria, set in Prague, until the end, when the late Nawab stirs on his deathbed, and we are returned to an earlier scene where Nawab first met Meenakshi. The frame story, therefore, emerges itself, therefore, as sort of yet one more story. So even the frame story turns into one more story amidst the medley of narratives thrown up on screen. This kaleidoscope of narratives, where even the frame story offers an ultimately unstable frame, does, superficially at least, lend the film a postmodern feel. Similarly, Hogan interprets the rhythmic arrangement of shots in the opening, edited to have a mixture of short, rapid succession scenes depicting everyday activity on the roads of Hyderabad, coupled with Nawab's voiceover, as intimating Sufi themes that run parallel to what he sees as the film's postmodern inflections. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the film itself, but the opening sequence, if you get a chance to watch it, is well worth a watch. The scene begins with a low-angle tracking shot of a rickshaw before switching to a medium shot of Nawab riding the rickshaw and looking through his binoculars at the hustle and bustle of the city. The editing intercuts point-of-view shots with medium close-up shots of Nawab so that the viewer switches between observing Yadav's character, so Yadav's character is Nawab, as a distantiated observer, a little like Nawab himself who is observing the city, and the visual position of Nawab, given that the camera reveals what he is seeing. So this switching between the two kinds of shots, the point of view shot and then the medium close-up shot, constantly moves the audience from sort of taking up the subject position of Nawab observing the city to us then observing Nawab observing the city. This editing technique lends the scene an intimacy which is picked up in Nawab's stream of consciousness, which is delivered as a voiceover. So I'm going to quote, "कोई मिले के बिछड़े यहाँ किसको क्या पड़ी है, सब लोग चल रहे हैं, दुनिया यहीं खड़ी है, खामोशियों से कहें चलकर जरा पुकारें, ख्वाबों के जंगलों से आई हैं क्या बहारें, नींदों का ये जमाना बस और दो घड़ी है, सब लोग चल रहे हैं, दुनिया यहीं खड़ी है." I apologize for my accent. It may not be particularly good. What care has anyone, so a translation here, a rough translation. What care has anyone here of reunions or separations? The world remains where it is. It is people that seek new stations. From the silences somewhere, a cry comes forth. What a season of spring hath borne such chimeric dreaming. This dreamlike world is only for a while, as are its creations. The world remains where it is. It is people that seek new stations. Hogan reads this juxtaposition in the poem between an appearance of flux in the world and the essential immutability of the world, or some broader reality, as Sufi, though he acknowledges that given there is little context at present, so at the beginning of the film, there is little context of Sufism, this poem may seem merely paradoxical. But Sufi tropes, metaphors, and motifs are everywhere, according to Hogan. In the next scene, when Nawab rushes to a press conference organized by his publisher, Nawab explains how his current project is a story that may never be completed. Hogan comments, quote, "The point may seem postmodern, but here, as elsewhere, it is also Sufi. This is made clear by Nawab's explanation that the impediment to completing his story is due to his character. Nawab uses the English word, thus suggesting his own character or ego, the standard impediment on the Sufi path, as well as the character or protagonist he is writing about. He explains that his mind is cluttered with questions, a comment fitting for both a writer and a mystic." End quote. By dint of an accumulation of examples, Hogan makes a convincing case to see Sufism permeating the film as theme, providing its postmodern disunities an intensified thematic or emotional unity. Hussein also uses Sufism as the context within which to interpret the vagaries of Meenakshi's character. The song Nurun ala Nur, Light upon Light, employs several Sufi symbols and metaphors, both at the level of picturization and in terms of its lyrical content. It also introduces Meenakshi, although she does not speak or lip sync in the song and remains enigmatic throughout. This enigmatic aura, which is underscored by the other Sufi references in the song, persuades the audience to interpret Meenakshi as not only mysterious, but signifying mysticism generally and Sufism specifically. I don't know if everyone had a chance to watch the song, and if you haven't watched it, perhaps you're familiar with it anyway, because it was quite a popular song in its time. Quasi shrine, the traditional setting for Qawwalis. So if you look at the mise en scene of that particular song, you'll see that the way the camera swoops down and comes around these curved domes, it very much evokes the sort of shrines, that intellectual and artistic vision. The stylized Sufism of Nurun ala Nur, however, ran into trouble with many Muslim organizations in India, including the All India Ulema Council, Jamaat al-Ulema-e-Hind, and the Raza Academy, amongst others. While some of these organizations were scripturalist, or broadly reformist, some, like the Raza Academy, were Barelvi, who have traditionally been more open to Sufism and Sufi practices. In a statement to the press, Maulana Abdul Quddus Kashmiri, General Secretary of the All India Ulema Council, said, "For us, the term Nurun ala Nur is very sacred. It shouldn't be used to describe the physical beauty of a heroine." Ironically, unfortunately perhaps, the Maulana went on to say that he hadn't actually watched the film or seen the film, but the controversy nonetheless led to Hussein withdrawing the film from the cinemas. While this outcome may confirm for liberal minds the fundamental intolerance of organized religion, Hussein's blending of postmodern practices with motifs, symbols, and metaphors that evoke Sufi beliefs, customs, and traditions may also be cast as an irreverent mimesis rather than a meaningful engagement with authentic form. If read this way, Hussein may be guilty of what Ziauddin Sardar sees as the proclivity of postmodernism to appropriate, package, and sell. He writes, quote, "Postmodernism posits that realities are something we can all acquire or buy at a cut-price sale in the bazaar of realities. The dupes of somnolent wishfulness who buy karma cola mysticism, quick-fix Hindu meditation schemes, and perverted Sufism are getting just what they pay for, consumer products." End quote. While scathing, Sardar's point is borne out by Peter Manuel's research into the popularity of Sufi music in the North Indian music scene. A commonly voiced criticism, Manuel writes, is that the Sufi music vogue is a shallow, urban, bourgeois fad whose performers lack any serious or long-standing engagement with or understanding of genuine Sufi traditions. Quoting from an interview with the artist Manjit Bawa, reported in News Time Weekend, Manuel cites Bawa's reservations at the commercialization of Sufism. People use Sufism, Bawa says, to foster their own interests. That is why you see fashion shows and dance programs and many other purely commercial ventures exploiting Sufism. It's just another way of making money. End quote. But there is a problem, I think. This is a very critical point of view, and it's important, but I think there's a problem. The allegation of exploitation may not sit easily against Hussein, who withdrew Meenakshi after protests, claiming, "I have not made the film to make money." Nor can the allegation of a lack of understanding of the subject matter be leveled at him, given his recurring professional interest in Sufism. Sardar's scathing critique of postmodernism, therefore, cannot be extended easily to Hussein or his film. But if the charge of exploitation, lack of understanding, or shallow engagement are too harsh and clumsy interpretation of the presence of Sufism in a film like Meenakshi, a more nuanced reading reveals the presence of an impulse in Indian cinema towards the aestheticization of Muslims and Islam in Bollywood, which the recent profusion of Sufism on the Hindi screen represents. Ian Almond's detailed analysis of Orhan Pamuk's The Black Book reveals interesting parallels with Hussein's filmic uses of Sufism. The same devices of narrative fragmentation, a play with meaning and liminality, and paradox are as essential to characterization, operate in Pamuk's book as they do in Hussein's film. Read as an intensive examination of Turkish national identity, The Black Book has been enthusiastically termed postmodern by Western critics eager to find a writer who delights in shredding preconceived dichotomies. For Almond, Pamuk's protagonist, Jalal's fascination with the 14th century Sufi, Rumi, not only invites us to see him, Jalal, as a modern-day Rumi, but also implicitly proposes the Black Book itself as a kind of Mesnevi, a collection of Sufi stories. Once again, Sufism and postmodernism are brought into a relationship, and Almond proceeds to show the various ways in which the Black Book reinvents and rewrites the various vocabularies of Islam. It is this play with vocabularies and signs which is most relevant for discussions of Sufism and Hindi cinema. For Almond, a thematic concern with identity runs throughout the Black Book, and he partly foregrounds this through Pamuk's own words, demonstrating the dualism that the novelist sees within himself. He quotes Pamuk, I should say. "At the center of my life, there is rationality. On the other hand, I open myself to other texts, those of the East and those of Sufism, for example. I don't see these texts as a necessity. I take pleasure in them. I feel joy. Perhaps my books find themselves without bickering or scuffling between these two centers." End quote. Almond interprets this as Pamuk admitting two selves, a Western, secular, pro-Enlightenment rationalist, and an alternative self, implicitly Eastern, more closely linked with feelings and pleasure. Leaving aside the Orientalism that's at play here, we'll put that to one side for now. The workings and illusions of identity feature as key thematic concerns in Pamuk's novels, and also act as the plane on which Almond sees Pamuk's use of Islam play out. In the first instance, Islam is used as a way of grounding a true and original Turkish identity through its utilization as a politically useful storehouse of images to supply the citizen with a carefully constructed series of heritages, destinies, and hopes. Yet paradoxically, Islam, in the form of Sufism notably, is also used to dismantle the notion of identity, in particular the notion of the self. Almond shows how Pamuk's treatment of Rumi becomes a strategy to question and cultivate the possibility of different selves, so that Pamuk ends up using the figure of Rumi and his attendant histories as a way to, quote, illustrate his own secular beliefs concerning the illusion of the self. The key tenet in Sufism of Fanaa is ultimately reappropriated by Pamuk with a much more secular aim in mind, re-narrated to us in a text like the Black Book, the story of Rumi as he wanders frantically around the streets of Damascus looking for his dead lover, loses its spiritual weight and becomes a deconstructive parable for the dissolution of selfhood into a confused nothingness. End quote. This malleability of Sufism, its ability to both set something up and then deconstruct it, this malleability of Sufism is what links Hussein's film to Pamuk's novel. Both artists appropriate Sufism to a modern, secular, non-theistic end. In Hussein's case, the Islam and Sufism presented in Meenakshi is one that is aesthetic rather than theological. It contains little in the way of the Quran, the controversy notwithstanding, or the Sunnah, sayings and practices of the Prophet Muhammad. There is little sense of a scholarly world or even one of the Pir and his murid. No Arabic Islamic calligraphy is ever shown on screen, and no Arabic Islamic sounds are heard, like the azan, call to prayer, or the recitation of the Quran. No character is shown reading Salah, the formal prayers, and no Islamic stories are embedded in the dialogue or lyric of the songs. Instead, the motifs, symbols, and metaphors of Sufism are drawn on for their aesthetic quality. For Hussein, Sufism offers an indigenous Indian sociolect through which he captures the delicate, non-theistic, transcendent nature of imagination. As such, Meenakshi, though not Islamic, is certainly Islamicate in the sense that Hodgson has used the term and developed the term. Hussein's indulgence in this paradigm is clear from the numerous examples or references to an Indian Islamicate heritage throughout the film. Nawab's character, for instance, is an anachronistic persona of a noble of the late 19th century, who isn't referred to by name but by an old-fashioned title that harks back to the Mughals. Similarly, Nawab's costume, which consists almost entirely of sherwanis, a type of frock coat, not only identifies him as Muslim, as this is a dress traditionally associated with Muslims in the subcontinent, but also with a hitherto gentry of Muslim aristocrats in Mughal India. Hussein's use of an Indian Islamicate adds a certain flair and refinement to Meenakshi that confers upon it a certain elevated sense of artistic elegance due to its association with the arts of the Mughals and their culture of adab, etiquette. Even the architecture of Nawab's home resembles a quasi-haveli, the mansion of nobles in pre-independent Indian cities, and of zamindars, landowners in rural areas. This space, due partly to its size, gets transformed for the Mendi celebrations, which again is associated with Muslims in India, though also a Hindu custom, while the qawwali that is played during it carries Indian Islamicate overtones, as of course does the ornate Urdu that Nawab speaks with words like Janab and Khalajan. Finally, food features prominently in the frame narrative, with Nawab shown at one point in the film enjoying a dish of biryani that Meenakshi has prepared. The food, and the biryani specifically, signifies Mughali cuisine, and once again, therefore, an Indian Islamicate context. Bit by bit, then, Hussein impresses upon his audience the Islamicate as a frame of reference for his film. Instead of seeing Hussein's use of Sufism as merely a plundering of the rich traditions of Islam in South Asia, it may be more accurate to see Hussein as achieving two distinct outcomes through his appropriation and presentation of the motifs, symbols, and metaphors by which we perceive the presence of Sufism in his film. Firstly, Hussein manages to infuse Sufi Islam within an Indian Islamic heritage that grounds Muslims firmly within India itself. Secondly, it aestheticizes Muslim traditions, customs, beliefs, and practices in opposition to their politicization, presenting Muslims as cultural citizens and not merely political subjects or denizens within an Indian state. By this sleight of hand, the film attempts to rehabilitate Muslims within an Indian imaginary. And so I go back to what I said at the very beginning, which is that within Indian cinema, there are these two parallel sort of streams, if you will. One that is full of tension and conflict, and that's generally when the Muslim is presented or represented through a political frame. And yet on the aesthetic side, there's a much softer, accommodating, enjoyable, perhaps even, a treatment of the Muslim and the Islamic tradition. And I want to now illustrate this finally through a song, and which I think is important, and it comes from Milan Luthrier's critically acclaimed Dirty Picture. The song, which was on the pre-reading list, is Mera Ishq Sufiana. The film, Dirty Picture, is based loosely on the life and career of South Indian dancer and actress Vijay Lakshmi Vadalapati, screen name Silk Smitha, who was best known for her erotic dance numbers and playing vamp roles. True to its title, the film is daring and characterizes a creative shift in Bollywood. To find a Sufi song in such a film may first seem inappropriate and out of place, leading one to think of its presence as merely part of that commercial or idea of trivialization that Ananya Jahanara Kabir, Peter Manuel, and others have noted. However, it is precisely because of this that its presence is not necessarily debased or undermined. Rather, the Sufi song offsets the reflexively witty narrative that is certainly salacious and seedy, but ironically so. Amid so much sex and sexual innuendo in Dirty Picture, the song, Mera Ishq Sufiana, provides a certain elegance and authenticity otherwise missing in the superficial glitz and kitschy glamour of South India's film industry during the 1980s when the film is set. The scene that immediately precedes the song sets up the potential of the Sufi dream sequence to single-handedly offset the film's playfully engaged, titillating idiom. Disowned by the very people who exploited her in their invention of her as a star, Silk is left alone and without any friends during the second half of the film. At this point, the character of Abraham enters Silk's life as an unexpected and unlikely lover, given his strong aversion to her throughout. But this love affair is very different from all the others Silk has been involved in, mostly because when Abraham's initial animosity gives way to his latent attraction, he sees her for who she is, a broken character whose vulnerability comes from her own strength. Silk is vulnerable because her power is premised on her sexuality, which, as the film presents it, is a currency within a heteronormative patriarchal system. As a visionary director, Abraham wants to create meaningful cinema, and this positions him as an outsider in an industry dominated by formulas and commercialism. Silk, too, is an outsider. She is related to no famous personalities, cannot speak English, is uneducated, and comes from a rural backwater. Both Silk and Abraham, therefore, are outsiders, and this lends the love that grows between them a uniqueness absent from all the prurient love affairs shown on screen. True to form, though, this love is not of the sanitized variety stereotypical of many run-of-the-mill Bollywood films. It is one characterized by a fiercely frank appraisal of character and their reality. Silk is not suddenly transformed into a bashful, virginal character, but remains the promiscuous temptress. The attraction between her and Abraham, however, still manages to appear more than simply libidinal, and this is largely because of the song Mera Ishq Sufiana and the dialogue that comes before it. Not hiding her reality, Silk replies to Abraham's question regarding ever having fallen in love by saying, "Of the type that leads you to bed? Many times. Of the type that makes you sleepless out of excitement and joy? Never." Abraham then looks at her more intensely and asks in whispered tones, "How many people have touched you?" Matching his whispered tone, she replies, "Many have touched me, but few have touched me." This tender moment splits Silk into two selves, one that is public and profane, continually exploited and used for vicarious pleasures, and another that is private, hidden, lost even. It is the second that momentarily appears sacred and pure. The Sufiana song that follows this short exchange does not debase the Sufi tradition necessarily, but appears as a way of conferring authenticity and meaning on a love that stands out of all the carnal pleasures that congregate around silk as a signifier.
रब की कवाली है इश्क कोई, दिल की दीवानी है इश्क कोई, महकी सी प्याली है इश्क कोई, सुबह की लाली है इश्क, गिरता सा झरना है इश्क कोई, उठता सा कलमा है इश्क कोई, सांसों में लिपटा है इश्क कोई, आंखों में दिखता है इश्क। मेरे दिल को तुझा से जुदा कर दे, यूं बस तू आशिकाना तेरे वास्ते, मेरा इश्क सूफियाना, मेरा इश्क सूफियाना, मेरा इश्क सूफियाना, तेरे वास्ते मेरा इश्क सूफियाना, मेरा इश्क सूफियाना, मेरा इश्क सूफियाना.
What is more, the fact that Sufism and its motifs, symbols and metaphors are mobilized to this end suggests the place of Sufism in the cinematic imaginary is as a paradigm of ultimate spiritual purity, used to express nuance and meaningful sentiment. Far from being trivialized, an Indian Islamic heritage in Hindi cinema could be read as offering an alternative emotional register by which Indian Muslims and Indian Islam are foregrounded. And you could challenge me on this. You could say that maybe this is far too generous a way of looking at what's going on in Dirty Picture, and that Ananya Jahanara Kabir and Peter Manuel are correct. The aesthetic then emerges as a key vehicle in Hindi cinema through which Islam, Muslims, and an Indian Islamic heritage find expression in that common Indian public culture that Rachel Dwyer has written about. Here, the motifs, symbols, and metaphors of Sufism offer an alternative spiritual ideolect to cinematic imaginary. Sufi Islam and its emphasis on devotion rather than the law lends it well to be used as a paradigm of ultimate spiritual purity. But is the aesthetic merely a vehicle, and therefore expendable when new aesthetic conventions emerge? And I'm very much coming to the end of the talk now. Is this current confluence within Hindi cinema of the aesthetics of Hindi films and an Indian Islam or Islamic heritage indeed a fad, as Peter Manuel would put it? Not necessarily, that's my argument. Hindi films have always drawn on Indian Islam and Islamic traditions, and have done so in both narrative and aesthetic form. What I am trying to show is that in Bollywood currently, there is an overt aestheticization of Islam, Muslim practices, and an Indian Islamic heritage. So much so that even films that have little to do with these often draw on this heritage in their aesthetics simply because it is a normative feature of Hindi cinema and its history, much as it is of India itself. But whereas earlier films and their portrayal of this cultural heritage presented a vernacular vision of Islam and Muslims as part of Indian culture and constructed that culture as theo-magical with this depiction of miracles and providential plans. I'm thinking of Coolie, for example, or Allah Rakha, which is films sort of from the 80s, 70s and 80s. Cinema more recently has begun to express this common public culture as underpinned by a diffused sense of spirituality that is expressed most cogently in an aestheticized mode and taken up most actively through the idiom of Sufism. The causes of this change seem, however, to be more socio-economic than theosophic. Citing Desai as her reference point, Faiza Hijri has written that observers of Indian film have suggested that Bollywood films are increasingly marketed to the affluent diaspora, a shift that has resulted in many changes, one of which is a move away from a vernacular spirituality to one that is aestheticized. So that's my point, that one of these changes is a move away from vernacular spirituality to one that is aestheticized. A globally aware audience with a growing sense of sophistication, a move from small cinemas to the multiplexes, and the rise of a metropolitan middle class within India are not incidental to this new expression of the religious and the spiritual. And I contend that something similar is also at play within the presentation of Hinduism in Indian cinema too. The fact that Sufi Islam emerges as a vehicle to further this new aesthetic sensibility produces an aesthetic Muslim modernity, which, whether it sets out to or not, helps embed, on a subliminal level if nothing else, Islam as part of India's heritage and its present, if not its future. And so basically, the current situation in India with the government, with what's happening, the cultural understanding of Muslims and Islam becomes particularly important. So I'm just going to repeat that last sentence one more time, and that will form the end of my talk. The fact that Sufi Islam emerges as a vehicle to further this new aesthetic sensibility produces an aesthetic Muslim modernity, which, whether it sets out to or not, helps embed, on a subliminal level, if nothing else, Islam as part of India's heritage and its present, if not also its future. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. I think that was reading the film within the framework of how we understand how we Muslim in terms of representation in film. Thank you very much. Very, very engaging. And I was trying to distract you by saying that you only have 5 minutes, but then I was hoping that it would be me because I wanted you to go on. But have time
Thank
for
you.
student interaction as well. And I'm hoping that there will be quite a few who would want to answer or just clarify a doubt maybe. Let's begin with the students. I know one or two of my faculty, of my colleagues in the faculty also probably have something to say. One of them is writing a thesis on farming. She may want to come in at some point. Yes, students, let's begin quickly. We have limited time and let's make the most of it. Who would want to go first? And rather, do you want to begin and then the others can follow suit?
Astrimika dropping you in the deep end, Anuradha.
She's used.
Someone go.
She's completely used to it, Said. She will rise to the challenge. I'm hoping that she can hear me though. Okay, there's something on the chat. Well, there's this for third year honors student Said. She says, what makes Sufism lose its individuality? So, this is not one of my students. Did you also share the link with Monali?
I have. That might be Monali actually. So
yeah.
Monali is someone else that we met at the
welcome. Of course, I know her. We were on a seminar together last week.
Right.
Yeah, right. We're in touch. Hey, lovely Manali to have you here. And you want to ask Said what makes Sufism lose its individuality? Of course, I'm thinking she's asking you in relation to texts that you have picked up, or maybe as a more generic sort of question. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, there's two ways to interpret the question itself. How is individuality lost in Sufism? And that's partly the notion of Fanaa and the spiritual practice, in which you suddenly realize that the ego, the self, is not so important, and it's meant to dissolve, which I think is a notion very much that cuts across the religious traditions, all, whether it's the Bhakti tradition in Hinduism or the Gnostic tradition in the Christian world. The idea of the self as something that ultimately is illusory. But maybe the question could be flipped the other way. Is the Sufi individual, the individual kind of quality of Sufism lost in this aestheticization? Is somehow, the more critical commentary on people like Kabir, people like Manuel and Sardar, who are very, very suspicious of this sort of appropriation and aestheticization, does that make Sufism lose its individuality? You could argue that it does, that like anything which sort of moves towards a kind of popularization sort of almost has to fit a certain narrower conception so as to become much more pervasive. But I think that would be short-sighted. I think what is happening in the Muslim representational field, if you like, of Indian cinema is it's a method. I think that's how I'm interpreting it. It's a method of moving towards normalization, normativeness. Whereas if the political sort of space is constantly throwing up the Muslim as an oddity, as a problem, how do you integrate? Who is this figure? You know, are they the fifth column? Right? You know, what is their relationship to Pakistan, which has always been something that's been a bit of a plague, I suppose, to many within the Indian political sort of frame. The aesthetic is a method of normalizing it. You know, one of the beauties of India, I think personally as an outsider, is its absolute. You know, we say that Britain is multicultural. Well, for goodness sake, you know, India trumps Britain sort of several fold over. You know, that's one of the greatest things about India for me as an outsider, and the aestheticization as a means of normalizing and producing an alternative normative expression of spirituality within the Indian imagination, I don't think makes Sufism lose its individuality. I think it brings it within the pantheon of the great spiritual traditions of India.
Thank you so much.
Do you want to turn on your camera, Nati? I didn't know we had a guest, so I should have also welcomed you warmly, as warmly as I did.
Thank you so much, Sayed. It was really lovely hearing from you. Yeah, thank you for answering my question as well. And thank you, Rimika. It was a lovely thing that you did. It's a lovely talk that you had.
Pleasure. They did mention that people may join in, and I said absolutely, why not? I didn't know that you were one of them. So my pleasure entirely. Let's go over to the other questions also. I just hope there are a few before we let Sayed go.
Ma'am, may I ask something?
Yes, please. That's Anuradha Said. She's a postgraduate student, and I think she, of course, can access her mic. Go ahead, Anuradha.
Good evening, everyone. Sir, that was a very enriching lecture. I think most of us are still processing all that information that you shared. What I wanted to ask was, how do Muslim modernities coexist in cinema and politics? Like, if at all they do, how do they coexist?
Yes, it's a good question. So there is some of my work, and a lot of my work, in fact, has began sort of in the political and then shifted to the cultural. How does a political Muslim modernity exist? I'm for me, one of the things about modernity is I'm trying very hard to not talk about it as how are Muslims being modern or how are Indians being modern. For me, modernity is a kind of much more organic process of responding to the present. I think that's for me how I'm interpreting modernity, and I'm using Peter Wagner and others to very much develop that idea of modernity, not as emulation or a kind of second-hand expression of what was originally Western and then how we're indigenizing it, but very much how a culture and community respond in the present. So for me, the political modernity is one fraught with difficulties. The Muslim political modernity is one that is caught in a place of negotiation and defense, which is perhaps the flip side of the aesthetic. So if the aesthetic is trying to embed and normalize, the political modernity is one where the Muslim characters are constantly under a sort of lens of suspicion to a large extent, having to perform. Now, I say this very conscious that actually it's a fast-moving picture. You know, films are being released every year and things are changing. I think what I'm saying holds largely true for the 90s, holds mostly true for the early 2000s. But I've noticed that more recently, even the political films are sort of making certain interesting alternative presentations. So I'm thinking of Guy Portier, I think in particular, which was sort of a few years old now, where that same kind of agonizing sort of discourse on belonging, the kind that it was expressed in Sarfarosh, you know, I'm a Muslim, I'm an Indian, and that constant having to revise your Indian identity, if you will, is actually also somewhat being sublimated. It's being sort of presented as that's quite old hat. Now, I don't know what will happen with Indian cinema in the current sort of moment, with what's been happening in the sort of real political sphere of India, with the sort of minority and identity sort of politics that is playing out over the last year or so. So to answer your question, Anuradha, it's a good question. The political modernity that I have written about thus far has been one mostly characterized by conflict and difficulties of belonging, which has been an interesting development. It's if you pick up something like, gosh, I'm really trying to remember the names now of the early films. Sort of, you've got black and white, very early cinema, which isn't having the same kind of problems with Muslim characters. It's driven much more by a kind of Nehruvian belief in the need for commonality and to sort of dampen down communal feelings and communal sort of strife. But around the late 80s and into the 90s, the political frame really brings out that the modern Muslim in India is a conflicted and problematic figure. And the various narratives of those films then try and negotiate, interact, and possibly sometimes neutralize. So in a film like Amir, a little bit more recently, 2000 and gosh, I can't, 2008 maybe, 2010. It's interesting that the figure of Amir ultimately makes a sacrifice and then dissipates. So the idea that the Muslim figure in the political frame needs to rehearse, express, and then subsume, blend back into the Indian populace, right? Without standing out too much, without sticking out too much, without making too many demands on the political in the political ground. Can I just add, this also has interesting things, therefore, to do with the other problems that may be taking place in the Indian political sphere of caste and other kinds of issues. The idea of sticking out becomes a problem, and the need to become part of a homogenized India becomes increasingly the battleground, really. To what extent will India be able to express its diversity, or will it require its minorities to fall within some kind of homogenized space? So I think that's the political modernity that's expressed in the cinema and in the cinematic imagination.
I think Anuradha did get her answer. In fact,
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, sir.
the way you finished this answer actually the whole mess that India finds itself constantly in, you know, between Hindu fundamentalism vis-a-vis Muslim terrorism. So that also aspect, and I do know that you are interested in that as well, because one of the other readings looks at you know, the whole shooting and the whole idea of
That's right, of Muslim terrorism. That's right. Yes.
Absolutely. I think there should be a question or two more, because another student texted me privately saying that she can't access her mic, but she's typing her question out. I think her question is, how is Sufism used, and that's within quotes, in films from Pakistan? I mean, you are looking at Indian cinema, but have you also studied Pakistani films in terms of, you know, how Sufism is brought into play there?
I haven't, is the honest answer, but I welcome that question because I think it's a fertile ground, really, for exploring. Pakistani cinema is something I'm very interested in, partly because it seems to have sort of suddenly emerged again, for, you know, many decades of kind of silence or very regional, poor quality, I would say. as well in the sort of certainly in the 90s and so on and so forth. I think Sufism is being used, mobilized in similar fashion. I think it's the sort of zeitgeist, if you will, in a kind of global modernity where Muslim terrorism is such a sort of prominent element in the minds of many. Sufism is being brought in as a kind of antidote, a kind of way of expressing an Islam, which sort of isn't as brutal, as sort of hegemonic as the Salafist or the Wahhabist traditions are. And that's useful up to a point. It's really helpful to sort of showcase the variety within Islam itself, because I think one of the problems is that the scripturalist expressions of Islam appropriate for themselves the definition of orthodoxy and thus present them as themselves as the only way. And I think this is useful, therefore, for Muslims themselves. So if in Pakistan, my hunch is that Sufism is being used in a very similar way. So I'm going to give a very obvious example. I mean, if you pick up something like Khuda Ke Liye, which was sort of, one of the one of the first films that reintroduced Pakistani cinema back into a kind of global recognition and discourse. Khuda Ke Liye very much is flirting with that much softer, spiritual, ambiguous kind of language, that sociolect, which I suggest is associated with Sufism, as a counterpoint. So Nasiruddin Shah's sort of famous speech in the courtroom, if you're familiar with Khuda Ke Liye, where he talks about how the beard is in Islam, Islam is not in the beard. That famous line which sort of became a meme for a little while, did the rounds. I think it's useful for Muslims also to recognize the cultural aspect of religion, that religion is expressed through culture as much as it is a kind of thing on its own. I think what happened in the 80s and 90s in the Muslim world was a detachment of culture from religion. So there was this zeal to return to the pure text. And really, what was happening was that we were all kind of picking up a Saudi Arabianized Islamic expression, mistaking it as true Islam, right? So I think that what the value of cinema, Bollywood, and Pakistani cinema is to remind us all that actually religion is mediated through culture. You cannot have such a thing as the pure scripture on its own. It's always looked at through the lens of the color, the taste, the sort of flavor of culture. And that softening is, I think, for me personally, a very welcome thing.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think now we will quickly forward to my colleagues who you will also sort of meet, because some of them didn't come in before we started. So a quick round. Rani, are you around? Do you have access to your mic, and would you want to just maybe comment or just quickly ask something? Dr. Rani Rathore, I think she is around. I just hope she can. Yes, Rani? I don't know. Can you hear her, Saeed? Because I can't.
I can't, no.
Okay. Oh, Lord, that's the problem, every now and then. We'll go across to Sucharita, and if she can access hers. Feel free to type in also. I mean, I'm looking at the chat box as much as I'm looking at Saeed on the screen. So I have my eyes like really wide open for anything that comes from me. Right. Sucharita, can you access your mic? Do you want to type in a quick response to the box? While she does that, Shruti, do you want to come in? Dr. Shruti Raval.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes, hi, Shruti.
Hello.
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah, good evening, sir. Good evening, all. I think that was a very not only enriching but certain observations from both the movies that one has seen, but the minute details that were brought forth in the paper very enriching in itself. Also, though I think we're suffering from a shortage of time, so if at all sir wants to take, I would like to ask, do you think movements like Sufism at all are less radical versions or more acceptable and popular versions of the religion? So if at all, ma'am, there is time. Otherwise, thank you so much. Thank
I
you.
think as long as Saeed can give a quick fix answer to it, we can take
Sure.
all questions.
I would say yes to an extent, but like so many of these things, it depends. The devil is in the detail, isn't it? Sufism, when the West first encounters sort of certain kinds of Islam, there is an early sort of Orientalist um, disdain for the Sufi, the shrine, the saint, the whirling. It all seems rather sort of silly, I think, to the early Orientalists, and they see the scripturalist tradition as much more rational and in keeping with the Enlightenment tradition of rationality. And now suddenly it's seen that that scripturalist tradition can bear such teeth that it can create great discomfort. So I'm nervous about just simply flipping and looking for the best kind of Islam and promoting it. What I think is helpful is to deny the title of orthodoxy to the scripturalist tradition. I think that for me is a project much better to argue that actually one lives in a hybrid reality. And that's, I think, something that Sufism is more able to survive in because it is linked to poetry, it borrows from the Bhakti tradition, it borrows from Gnosticism in Christianity. It is a space where you don't lose your Muslimness or your Islam, but you're also very much open to other ways of living and expressing and thinking. So to that extent, yes.
I think Shruti, that was very convincingly answered question. Hope you're academically satisfied with the
Oh dear.
one.
Thank you.
There are a few more. I think my colleagues have, suddenly come into action, but I feel terrible, Sucharita, because we will be really going over time, since your questions require very long answers. But I'm still going to read them out to you. And Saeed, with your permission, I will share your email ID with some of my students and colleagues who have not been able to, come out with their questions in time, but they may probably, have you
I
to them over emails, if that's all
I'd be
right.
delighted. I'd be
One,
delighted.
I'll still read it out, considering you may have time to quickly think of it while I. So Sucharita said that what are your views on the depiction of Muslims in films like Mulk? Now that assumes that you have watched Mulk. I don't know. Have you watched this film, Saeed? Because this is a very specific to that film question.
I haven't. I'll be honest. I haven't seen it,
Right.
so I'm not. Yeah.
Okay. No worries. Rani, of course, has connectivity issues. We could see that because I can see her in the session, but obviously she can't access her mic. She says, what do you think are some recent theories that one can apply while researching Sufism as a point of academic entry to understanding the religion, or maybe beyond the religion in terms of the spiritual aspect? Any
Got theories.
Mm.
The kind of. Yes,
Sorry.
go ahead.
No, I'm saying you can think and maybe respond as in email, text, because I think these are
Thank you.
these are not one-line answers, but I still want them to feel part of the discussion. And that's about it. Bhaskar sir, do you have something to say? If not, ask. You can also compliment sir for the fantastic.
Yes, absolutely. It was
Yes.
a very, very fantastic discourse, and lots of things were really discussed, which we would otherwise not think of in that particular way. One question, sir, if I can ask, is this is one liner. Sufism, as you say, is non-theistic, or that's what I actually gathered. If it is non-theistic, is it in any way at loggerheads, not with Quran, but the interpreters of Quran, or the maybe the Maulanas, how they do it? Because there was a time when I started reading the Quran, and I found that there was some kind of subtle differences between the thinking of a Sufi and that has been taught in the Quran. This was my question. Thank you so much.
Right, sir.
Thank you.
Is there a quick response to this, or would you?
Quick response. No, I will try. I'm honored to be asked the question. Let me think. So, yes, there is, and I think that's sometimes what breeds the suspicion of more scripturalist adherents of Islam to the Sufis, because they are seen as moving too far away from the scripture. To that extent, Sufism, and I think Bruinsman sort of speaks about this, the idea that Sufism isn't a singular thing, but that there is a tradition. And even within the Sufi tradition, there has been some critical talk about shrines and the practices that happen, the excesses. So yes, Sufism does run the difficulty of moving quite far away from the scripture, from the Quran and the Sunnah, etc. But I think what Sufism brings to the Islamic sort of mosaic is a poetry, a way of thinking about religion that moves it away from law. To treat the Quran as a law book, I think, has been one of the most limiting elements of within the Muslim imagination.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely, and how correctly and how boldly answered, Said. Bravo.
Thank you.
Fantastic. I think with this we come to the end of the queries. I will pass on your email ID, Said, because I think one of my students, Disha, and probably Sucharita, my colleague, and also Rani, may like to converse with you over email, because they are pertinent questions, and they just need that bit of thrashing out with somebody who's studying it, but a bit more than somebody who's merely interested in it. So I guess
Sure.
With that, probably we should. There's nothing else. That's it. Yeah. I've looked at everyone. Thank you so much, Said. The formal vote of thanks for not only agreeing to do it, but I know it was Eid for you all yesterday. It was very hectic. Must have been the way Diwali are with us. We know all about each other's festivals in terms of the events and the pre-prep and the one and the post. All of that. So thank you very much for making time. And,
thank you so much also, everyone, and I'm honored to have had such a erudite sort of audience asking such wonderful questions. And and extending an invitation, should anyone be in London or flying through, please do share my email, Rimika, and I'll be delighted to sit down and have a coffee and have a longer chat.
That includes me as well, right?
Of course, Rimika, you'll be at the front of the list, I think.
Wonderful. So we'll take you up on that invitation. Maybe even we'll come and visit your institution where you at. You hold a very fancy thing there of academics and so on and so forth. I think pretty fancy and a lot of work, I'm sure. So thank you very much once again, Dr. Said Heather. It was absolutely a delight to have you over and listen to your very, very riveting talk. Thank you once again. And bye, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.